Nestled in the French countryside, the stately manor of Charles Dumont, a celebrated composer of the 19th century, was a place of grandeur and music. Renowned for his evocative operas, Dumont hosted lavish soirées at his estate, where the elite of Paris gathered to marvel at his talent. But beneath the gilded chandeliers and velvet curtains lay dark secrets that would later taint the manor's reputation forever. The Dumont estate was a sprawling masterpiece of its time, with marble floors, intricately carved woodwork, and a grand piano in the main hall where Dumont composed his hauntingly beautiful melodies. Yet, the house seemed to possess a strange aura, a palpable tension that unnerved even the most skeptical visitors. Locals whispered about the tragic death of Dumont's wife, Eloise, who had fallen from the grand staircase under mysterious circumstances. Others spoke of guests who attended his parties but were never seen again, vanishing without a trace. Over time, the estate became shrouded in rumors of ghostly apparitions and eerie music echoing through its empty halls. One of the most chilling tales emerged from Dumont's last grand ball. Witnesses described hearing a symphony unlike any other, a piece so haunting it brought tears to their eyes. Yet, as the final note lingered in the air, 5 guests vanished. No one saw them leave, and no evidence of foul play was ever found. The only clue was a single sheet of music, titled Requiem for the Lost, left on the piano. Over the decades, accounts of ghostly activity multiplied. Visitors reported seeing shadowy figures wandering the halls, hearing whispers in rooms long abandoned, and encountering phantom musicians performing ethereal tunes. Some even claimed to see Dumont himself, seated at his piano, playing the same mournful requiem. In recent years, historians and paranormal investigators have delved into the mysteries of the Dumont Manor. They uncovered letters suggesting that Dumont was obsessed with immortality, dabbling in occult practices. Some believe he struck a deal with a dark force, trading the souls of his guests for eternal fame. Excavations on the property revealed hidden chambers beneath the manor. These rooms contained macabre artifacts, personal belongings of the missing guests, cryptic symbols etched into the walls, and a weathered book of spells. Today, the house of Charles Dumont stands abandoned, a chilling reminder of its sinister history. Few dare to enter, and those who do often leave shaken, their minds haunted by unexplainable sights and sounds. Visitors say the music never stopped. On moonlit nights, faint strains of a piano can be heard, as if Dumont is still composing from beyond the grave. The haunting melodies, once celebrated for their beauty, now serve as a requiem for those lost to the darkness that consumed the house. Would you enter the Dumont estate, risking an encounter with the lingering spirits of its luxurious and tragic past? In 2024, a peculiar announcement sent ripples through the paranormal community. The Dumont estate, long sealed by local authorities, was suddenly opened to the public for a one-night event. Organized by a mysterious benefactor known only as AD, the invitation promised a once-in-a-lifetime experience. A tour of the infamous manor, followed by a live performance of Dumont's Lost Symphony, Requiem for the Lost. The event immediately captured global attention. Musicians and historians alike were baffled. Requiem for the Lost was thought to exist only as fragments. Yet the invitation claimed the full score had been discovered. Speculations ran wild. Was this a hoax, a publicity stunt, or something far more sinister? On the appointed evening, a select group of 13 attendees gathered at the gates of the Dumont estate. They included journalists, skeptics, historians, and paranormal investigators, each handpicked and sworn to secrecy about the event. Among them was Clara Moreau, a young musicologist obsessed with Dumont's work, and Dr. René Valois, a scientist determined to debunk the manor's paranormal reputation. As the group entered the estate, the air seemed to thicken with anticipation. The once grand mansion was shrouded in decay, but the intricate woodwork and faint glimmers of gilded mirrors hinted at its former glory. A strange, almost imperceptible hum seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, a sound that resonated just below the threshold of hearing. The tour began innocuously enough. Their guide, a man clad in an antiquated black suit, recounted stories of Dumont's life and the infamous disappearances. But as they ascended the grand staircase, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew colder, and several guests swore they heard faint music drifting from the main hall. When they reached the ballroom, a chilling sight awaited them. The grand piano stood uncovered, its lid open, as if anticipating the touch of invisible hands. On the piano's surface lay the full score of Requiem for the Lost, inked in a hand far too precise for a century-old document. Without warning, the piano keys depressed on their own, producing the first haunting notes of the symphony. Gasps filled the room as the group realized there was no visible player. Yet the music continued, each note more beautiful and more terrifying than the last. As the guests listened, strange phenomena began to unfold. Clara noticed that the sheet music changed with every passing minute, the notes rewriting themselves as if alive. Dr. Valois tried to record the performance, but his equipment malfunctioned, emitting bursts of static that seemed to synchronize with the music. One by one, the guests began to feel an inexplicable pull toward the piano. Their reflections in the nearby mirrors shifted unnaturally, appearing older or younger or not at all. Clara, entranced, reached for the sheet music, only for the guide to intercept her with an iron grip. "You mustn't," he hissed. "It's not meant for the living." Just as the symphony reached its crescendo, the room plunged into darkness. The music continued, but now it was accompanied by ghostly whispers and the faint sound of footsteps encircling the group. When the lights flickered back on, one of the attendees was missing. Panic ensued as the guests searched the room, but there was no trace of the vanished individual, only their reflection lingered in the mirrors, frozen in silent terror. The guide's expression turned grim. "The house has chosen," he murmured. The remaining guests fled the ballroom, their footsteps echoing through the desolate halls. But as they sought the exit, they discovered a door that hadn't been there before, a towering black door carved with symbols matching those found in Dumont's hidden chambers. From behind the door came a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through their very bones. Clara, clutching a fragment of the rewritten score she had managed to grab, felt an overwhelming compulsion to approach. "It's a portal," she whispered, though she couldn't explain how she knew. "To where, I don't know, but this is where they went." The guide's voice, now trembling, broke the silence. "No one who enters returns. Yet the house always demands an offering." Before anyone could stop her, Clara stepped forward, the fragment of Dumont's music in hand. The door creaked open, revealing a blinding light and the faint silhouette of figures that resembled the long-lost guests of Dumont's fateful soirées. And then, the door began to close, dragging Clara and the truth further into the unknown. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. As Clara crossed the threshold, the door closed with a resonant boom behind her. The room fell silent, save for the faint echo of her gasp fading into the distance. The remaining guests stood frozen, staring at the black door, now inert and lifeless. Despite their terror, they noticed the faintest outline of Clara's silhouette imprinted on its surface, her form seeming to shift as if struggling against unseen forces. The guide turned sharply, his face pale as a specter. "It's begun again," he whispered, almost to himself. Without another word, he snuffed out his lantern, plunging the hall into darkness. Clara, meanwhile, found herself in a vast, otherworldly space. The light was dim, but not from any identifiable source. Instead, the air itself seemed to glow faintly, illuminating shadowy figures moving rhythmically, as if bound by some invisible symphony. Her eyes adjusted, and she realized the figures weren't strangers. They were the missing guests of Dumont's infamous soirées, dressed in their 19th century finery, faces blank, bodies swaying to the sound of music only they could hear. The air was thick with an oppressive melody, one that burrowed into her mind and forced her to remember moments she'd long forgotten or wished to forget. In the distance, she saw a figure seated at a grand piano, its back turned to her. The music radiated from it, growing more intense with each step she took toward it. She clutched the fragment of the rewritten score tighter, sensing it pulse with warmth as if alive. "Dumont," she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure paused its playing, and silence enveloped the space. Slowly it turned to face her. Back in the manor, The remaining group attempted to force the black door open, to no avail. Dr. Valois inspected the symbols carved into its surface, recognizing patterns that mirrored ancient alchemical texts. "This isn't a portal," he murmured. "It's a seal. And Clara, she's the key." His words were interrupted by a low, vibrating hum that emanated from the door. The piano in the ballroom began playing itself again, but the notes were discordant, jagged, as though something or someone was fighting against the music. A journalist in the group noticed her reflection in the hallway's cracked mirror. It moved independently of her, its expression contorted in anguish. As she turned to warn the others, her reflection raised a hand and pointed directly at the black door. Inside the otherworldly plane, Dumont's gaunt face bore a sorrowful expression, his once golden eyes now dimmed with regret. "You've brought it here," he said, his voice a mixture of relief and dread. His skeletal hands gestured toward the fragment of music in Clara's grasp. "What is this?" Clara demanded, holding it aloft. Dumont sighed, the sound heavy with centuries of grief. "It's not a composition, it's a map. A way to undo what I've done, or to finish it completely." As he spoke, the shadowy figures in the room began to converge, their movements more erratic, their faces flickering with faint traces of recognition. Clara's heart raced as she spotted her own reflection among them, staring back at her with an expression she couldn't decipher. "You must play," Dumont said, rising from the piano. "But beware, every note carries a cost. And once you begin, there's no stopping." Back in the manor, the group noticed their surroundings shifting. The once dilapidated walls now gleamed with gold leaf, and faint laughter echoed down the corridors, as though the house were reverting to its former glory. But the opulence came at a price. One of the guests screamed as their own reflection suddenly disappeared from the mirrors altogether, leaving behind only a faint smear of shadow. Valois stared at the symbols glowing faintly on the black door, realizing their pattern was evolving, rearranging itself like the notes of a symphony. "She's trying to change the music," he muttered. "But what happens if she fails?" The guide, who had remained eerily silent, finally spoke, his voice low and hoarse. "She won't fail. But the question is, will she survive what comes next?" In the other realm, Clara hesitated at the piano, the fragment of music now glowing so brightly it seared her hands. The figures around her whispered in unison, their words an unintelligible chant that seemed to guide her fingers to the keys. Dumont, standing beside her, looked almost human again, his features softening as he watched her prepare to play. "You may free them," he said, gesturing to the ghostly guests. "Or you may condemn them all and yourself with a single wrong note." As Clara's trembling hands touched the keys, the first note reverberated like a thunderclap, splitting the shadows and revealing something massive and pulsating in the distance, something that seemed alive and aware. "Who hears the music," Dumont whispered, "becomes part of it." And then, the unseen orchestra struck its first chilling chord. As Clara's fingers pressed the keys, the shadows in the room recoiled, writhing as though the music itself caused them pain. Yet, for every measure she played, the pulsating presence in the distance drew closer. Its form was indescribable, an ever-shifting mass of light and dark, its edges dissolving into tendrils that reached out with sentient intent. Dumont stood motionless, his sunken eyes fixed on the encroaching entity. "It's been waiting," he muttered, almost inaudibly, "for centuries, waiting for someone to finish what I started." Clara ignored him, her focus riveted to the keys. The fragment of music in her grasp now hovered in midair, glowing brighter with each note. Yet the score continued to shift, the notes rearranging themselves faster than her eyes could follow. She wasn't playing the music, it was playing her. "Clara," Dumont called, his voice shaking, "do not let it take control. If you falter—" A deafening crash interrupted him as one of the shadowy figures lunged at Clara. She flinched, her fingers striking a discordant chord. The entire realm seemed to shudder, and the glowing entity froze, its tendrils retracting momentarily before thrashing violently. The shadowy figure disintegrated, its scream merging with the echoing dissonance of the mistake. In the manor, the transformation accelerated. The walls bled opulence tapestries reappeared, candelabras flickered to life, and the faint smell of roses filled the air. But the beauty was grotesque. The roses decayed as quickly as they bloomed, and the flickering candles cast unnatural shadows that moved independently of their sources. The group in the hall now realized they were no longer alone. The reflections in the mirrors had taken on lives of their own, staring and grinning with malice. One mirror began to crack, spiderwebbing outward until a long, pale hand reached through the glass. "Move!" Valois shouted, pulling the nearest person away. But the guide stood firm, his expression grim. "There's nowhere to go. The house is alive. Now it won't let you leave until she decides its fate." Clara's surroundings shifted as she played, the shadowy realm giving way to vivid scenes from Dumont's past. She saw the grand balls, the laughing guests, and Dumont at his piano, his melodies enchanting everyone who listened. Yet, beneath the surface, there was something else, brief glimpses of Dumont in his study, poring over ancient texts, his face lined with desperation. In one vision, she saw him drawing a circle of salt and chanting in a language she couldn't comprehend. The air in the vision shimmered, and a figure emerged from the void, a towering, faceless being that seemed to radiate hunger. Dumont offered something unseen, and the being nodded before vanishing. As the vision faded, Dumont's voice echoed around her. "I thought I could control it, but it doesn't bargain, it only consumes." The glowing mass in the distance now loomed impossibly close. For the first time, Clara heard its voice, not words, but a deep, resonant tone that vibrated through her bones, carrying meaning without language. "Play it through," it seemed to say. "Finish the requiem, and I will give you what you seek." "What I seek?" Clara asked aloud, her voice breaking. A new vision unfolded before her, this one of her own life. She saw herself as a child, sitting at a piano while her mother beamed with pride. She saw herself years later, standing at a grave, clutching a wilted bouquet. The visions continued, moments of triumph, of loss, of choices unmade. The entity's presence grew stronger, the tendrils now brushing against her consciousness. "Finish it," it urged, its tone almost soothing now, "and I will rewrite it all. The pain, the regret, it can be undone." Behind her, the ghostly figures began to speak, their voices overlapping in a cacophony. "Don't listen," they pleaded. "It lies. We believed it too, and now we are part of the music." Dumont grabbed Clara's wrist, his gaunt face inches from hers. "If you finish, you'll bind yourself to it forever. But if you stop," he faltered, his gaze darting toward the encroaching entity. "If you stop, it might destroy us all." Clara hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keys. The fragment of the score glowed brighter, its notes now shifting so rapidly they seemed to blur into pure light. In the manor, the guests watched as the black door began to crack, light spilling through the fractures. The guide's voice rose in panic. "She's about to make a choice, but which one?" Valois grabbed the guide by his collar. "What happens if she finishes the music?" The guide's lips quivered as he answered. "She'll become the conductor. The house, the guests, even the entity, she'll control it all. But only if she survives the final note. And if she doesn't?" The guide's expression darkened. "Then it consumes everything. This house, her, us, and it begins again." As the door split open, a single piercing note rang out, shaking the very foundation of the house. The mirrors shattered, the candles extinguished, and a blinding light engulfed the hall. Clara's hands trembled as she prepared to play the last note. The entity loomed above her now, its tendrils weaving into the piano, merging with the keys. Time seemed to stretch as the decision hung in the balance. "Will you surrender?" Dumont whispered. The entity's voice resonated louder, more insistent. "Will you create?" Clara closed her eyes and struck the final chord. The world shattered into silence. As Clara's fingers pressed the keys, the final chord resounded with an earth-shaking resonance. The light within the entity flared, so bright it obliterated everything around her. Dumont, the shadowy figures, the piano itself. The sound reverberated endlessly, folding into itself until it became both infinite and nothing. When Clara opened her eyes, she found herself standing in the grand ballroom of the Dumont estate. The opulent room was eerily pristine, as if untouched by time. The otherworldly glow was gone, replaced by the golden light of chandeliers. For a moment, she thought she had returned to the living world. But the silence was wrong. Around her stood the guests from the séance and the long-lost partygoers from Dumont's era, all motionless, their faces blank. She turned to the grand piano, where Dumont sat, his hands resting on the keys. His once gaunt features were now vibrant, his golden eyes shining. "It's done," he said softly, standing to face her. "You've finished the symphony." Clara stepped back, the weight of his words sinking in. "But I didn't choose. I just played what it demanded." Dumont gave a sad smile. "That was the choice. The moment you played, you became part of it. And now so are they." He gestured to the silent crowd. "You've given it what it wanted, a new conductor, and an audience for eternity." Clara's heart raced as she realized the truth. The entity hadn't consumed her. It had bound her, entwining her soul with the music and the house. The guests, both past and present, were now her responsibility, their fates locked within the confines of the estate. The black door stood open behind her, a faint glow emanating from beyond. Clara turned to it, her pulse quickening with hope. "If the door is still open, I can leave, right? I can end this." Dumont's expression darkened. "You misunderstand. The door doesn't lead out, it leads deeper, to the place where the music begins." Clara stepped closer to the door, peering into its endless void. She could hear faint echoes, notes of the symphony, unfinished, beckoning her. "If you go through," Dumont continued, his voice tinged with desperation, "you'll find its heart. You might be able to destroy it, but it will fight you. And if you fail, you'll become it." Clara hesitated, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. Behind her, the spectral audience began to stir, their heads turning in unison to face her. Their eyes glowed faintly, their faces emotionless. They awaited her command, their eternal conductor. In the corner of the room, a shattered mirror caught her reflection. She gasped. Her face, though familiar, was subtly changed. Her eyes carried a golden sheen, and faint symbols glimmered along her arms, as if etched into her skin by the music itself. The guide's voice echoed in her mind. "She'll control it all, if she survives." With a deep breath, Clara approached the piano and sat down. Her hands hovered over the keys. If the house demanded a conductor, she would wield the role, but on her terms. The audience waited, the silence palpable. Then, with deliberate defiance, Clara struck a new chord, one not written in the fragment, one born of her own will. The house trembled, the chandeliers swaying violently. From the black door came a low, resonant growl, as though the entity itself recognized her rebellion. Clara's music filled the room, a furious counterpoint to the symphony that had trapped so many. The figures in the audience began to change, their blank faces flickering with expressions of confusion, pain, and, for some, hope. Dumont stepped forward, his golden eyes wide with awe and fear. "You're rewriting it," he whispered, "but it won't let you win easily." From the shadows, tendrils of darkness slithered toward her, but Clara played on, her defiant melody building to a crescendo. The black door trembled, its glow intensifying as the entity pushed against it, trying to reassert its dominance. As Clara played, she felt the house pushing back against her will, each note pulling at her mind, her soul. But she pressed on, her music rising in defiance of the centuries-old curse. The room erupted into chaos. Ghostly figures screamed, mirrors shattered, and the walls of the manor cracked as the entity roared through the black door. Clara's melody reached its peak, a final, resounding chord that reverberated through the house and beyond. And then silence. When the dust settled, Clara found herself alone in the ballroom. The black door was gone, replaced by an unbroken wall. The grand piano sat silently, its keys glinting in the dim light. Outside the windows, dawn was breaking, the first rays of sunlight piercing through the gloom. Clara stood, her legs trembling, and walked to the mirror. Her reflection stared back, fully her own. The golden sheen in her eyes was gone. She stepped out of the manor into the fresh morning air. The house stood silent behind her, its windows dark and lifeless. The curse was broken, or so it seemed. But as Clara walked away, she heard a faint, haunting note drift from the house, so quiet it could have been her imagination, or a reminder that the music never truly ends. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.